Abortion happens every day. Millions of people around the world will have an abortion each year. But the majority of those people will never talk about their abortion experiences. What if millions of people broke their silence and told the truth about their lives and their choices? This is Melissa Madera in Indianapolis, Indiana. And you're listening to the Abortion Diary podcast. These are the stories we share.
I have 2 abortion stories, and that is only something that I've recently talked openly about because that's not exactly accepted among people in general. But I had my first abortion when I was 21 years old, and I was a college student at the University of Cincinnati. I had been on the pill since high school. When I was about 17, I had a regular boyfriend, and so I'd gotten on the pill. But then when I went to college, I was sort of struggling financially. I didn't really have the financial support of my parents. And so I was working, on top of going to school, I was working and just sort of trying to make ends meet. So I went off birth control for a while. But I was aware of the risks of, unprotected sex. But of course, in the heat of a moment, I had unprotected sex, and it was a lot of fun. I remember the fellow being very, very beautiful, and it was a fun moment. Of course, later, when I realized I was pregnant, I was living in Atlanta, and I was doing an internship at IBM. And I remember being very anxious about it, going to the bathroom a lot, checking to make sure when I was getting my period. Of course, it never came. And the decision to have an abortion was really easy for me. I had been an athlete in high school. I graduated third in my class. There was an expectation that I was going to go to college and I was going to make something of myself because I had been raised by a single mother who had 2 kids when she was 21. I remember it being very hard for her, and although we had financial support from my dad, it was just always a struggle. And so I was very clear about that, that was not going to be my path. But so I made the decision to have an abortion easily. I think what complicated it was that I felt a real obligation to tell the guy. And so while I was living in Atlanta, and I could have easily have just gone across town to the clinic where I actually ended up working a few years later, I made a big point of going back to Cincinnati, not only to have the abortion, but initially to tell him. And as I already mentioned, I was already financially strapped. And so part of my first abortion story is very much like a lot of younger women in that I was scraping up money. I had made this decision to travel back to Cincinnati. And so it was costing me extra money that I didn't really have. The first return visit to Cincinnati, when I told him, he was very frank with me. It was not someone I dated. I mean, we kind of just had been hanging out. He wasn't my boyfriend or anything. But he was very clear with me that he already was raising one child and he couldn't take on another. And I said, that's fine. I said, I'm just telling you. I felt a real obligation to tell him. But he did agree to go with me to the clinic. And also a friend of mine went with me. I can't remember how I chose that clinic. It must have been my friend, who was a bit older than me, and I think she'd had an abortion, and I think I may have known that. So I'm imagining that she helped me find the clinic. So the funny part about traveling to Cincinnati to tell the fellow was that I ran out of gas on my way from Atlanta to Cincinnati. And I remember pulling into the gas station and begging the gas station attendant for a tank of gas. and I promised I would be back within 24 hours to pay him. I stayed with my old roommates. They had no idea why I was there. I was like in and out. I'm sure I was crazy. But I just had this real sense that I had needed to talk with them in person. And so I did, and returned home. I paid the gas attendant off and went back to my internship at IBM. And then when the appointment, I scheduled the appointment, I drove back to Cincinnati. My friend went with me. He was there. I don't remember a lot about it. I mean, it's been almost over 20 years now, but I do remember there were protesters outside. I remember there were gates. And during, it was before the 24-hour waiting period, so it was all done in one day. And the only thing I really remember was the nurse being, trying to be empathetic, but I found that to be annoying. I wanted the doctor to explain what was going on. And I just remember being annoyed with the nurse and asking the doctor a lot of questions, like during the procedure, like, what are you doing? And I remember him being friendly enough in providing the information, but I guess I just wanted the information. Either I hadn't gotten it, or I was curious, or I just wanted to know. So I don't know. I don't remember. But and that's really all I remember about that. Except that afterwards, I felt a lot of shame. I did feel guilt. There wasn't anyone for me to talk to about it. I hadn't even told my roommates. I hadn't told my family. I didn't tell anyone for many, many years, actually. So I felt isolated. And I think that's why I ended up working for Feminist Women's Health Center, to find community, to be surrounded by other women that had gone through this experience. I started out in the administrative office, but then ended up over at the clinic as a patient advocate. And so I was with other women that were having the procedures. And that was very cathartic for me. I learned a lot just about the procedure and about myself. And, but I also was younger, and I did have some reservations about second trimester abortions. At that time, I didn't know enough about the reasons why women might have a second trimester abortion. And so it was somewhat confusing for me. And unfortunately, I didn't feel like the clinic provided that sort of space or that discussion among staff. Like, we could talk through those sort of emotions or conflict within ourselves as staff. But I really did enjoy being there. But it was also at the time, it was around 96 when the clinic bombing occurred. And so between my own emotional conflict and the bombing, I decided to leave. And I went off and did other things. I ended up working in refugee resettlement for a long time. And I moved around. I got married. I got divorced. I got remarried. And then I did a master's in social work at the University of Louisville, where there's a lot of great work being done around reproductive rights. And so I did an internship with the ACLU, a Reproductive Freedom Project. And by this time I was in my mid-30s or early 30s. So I began working with the ACLU and still didn't really talk about my abortions, my previous abortion. Although I was on the, committee and I was helping to organize events, I didn't talk about my own abortion. And it was also there where I got exposed to the A Fund for the first time and began to understand and know about abortion funding. And I did one of my last graduate research program or project was parental consent laws. So I had was interviewing stakeholders, and I did a survey within the clinics and gathered information. And of course, very few other students were doing anything around abortion. I mean, although it was a social work program, abortion wasn't talked about. Even my professor, research professor, although she was supportive of it, she also told me that she was anti-choice. So, that was okay. And so I graduated, or I nearly graduated. I guess the other important part of this, although it's not directly related to abortion, but it's a really important moment in my life, isn't that I was sexually assaulted. It was the first day of class of my last semester. And I was raped at home in the middle of the night by a stranger. I think that moment was the reason why I was in social work school, because people would ask me, why are you getting a degree in social work? It's not really something people would naturally think about me, although I'm always been interested in policy. But I think in that moment, all those skills of listening and empathy and calming the situation and came into play for me. I mean, I remember thinking that my job was to stay alive and not to be harmed, and that I would do anything I had to do that. And that's what I did. And I remember, fortunately, I wasn't really harmed, real physically, which became a problem when it came to going to the police, because I had no physical cuts. I was terrified. I actually didn't go straight to the police. I went to work. I got dressed and I went to work. But I was a mess. And eventually I ended up that same day, back at the university with a friend of mine who got me to the campus center. But I wasn't believed. Fortunately, there was a DNA sample taken, a rape kit taken, and in the end, the perpetrator had already been in the system and was found and prosecuted, although not for my case. He was a serial rapist and had a record. But I tell this because it was the lowest point of my life. I was deeply depressed. I was experiencing a lot of PTSD, although I really didn't want to finish graduate school. I was terrified to be in my house. I wasn't sleeping. I was doing the assignments because I knew how to do that. I was a good student. And in fact, friends of mine later said, we didn't know anything was wrong. You acted as you always do. You asked questions and you participated in class like you always do. And yet, as I explained to somebody, I felt like I was walking around with no arm, and yet no one saw that. And I barely graduated. I did tell my professors, and so that helped, and I graduated. But it was really a really tough semester, obviously, and also it took me years to get over it. I was really just, nothing had ever happened like that to me before. And as someone that had been interested in social justice and rights, I was very conflicted. People were asking me about if I was carrying a gun or if I was taking medication. And I'm like, no, I'm not going to carry a gun. So I went off and worked with the union for a while, which was also important because I learned how to talk about issues and be proud of my values, not to apologize for tactics. And when I found myself then in New Orleans, I again was faced with another unplanned pregnancy, and it was a very different experience because I was much older and I had a lot more life experience. This time around, though, I was, in my early 40s. I was actually dating someone that I had been dating for probably a year. And I did give it a lot of thought as to whether I wanted to terminate the pregnancy. I thought, well, if I want to be a mother, like, this is my opportunity. And although I didn't think our relationship was fantastic, I thought, well, regardless of where the relationship goes, like, I'm strong enough. Like, I guess I was more accepting of the idea of being a single parent. Although I wasn't I was in a better financial position than I'd been when I was 21, but not great. I wasn't even working full time. But I did give it a lot of thought, and I actually talked to 2 male friends of mine that knew me really well and sort of talked about it. And I had one friend that had raised children, and he really encouraged me to keep it and to what a great mother I would be. And yet it was my other male friend that actually helped me find a clinic. And in the end, I did decide to terminate the pregnancy because I'm not interested in being a mother. I don't identify as a mother. I like children, but I don't want to raise children. And it took a moment for me to accept that. I'd always been childless, and even when I was married, people rarely asked me when I was going to have a child. I don't have these maternal instincts. And I think I just, I said, it's okay. It's okay for me not to be a mother. I'm happy with that decision in my life. So that was important, I think. And so I did make an appointment at the clinic here in New Orleans. And it was a different experience. Again, because I was older, but also I was much more aware of the laws. And having had an abortion when I was 20, I realized how things had changed so much in 20 years. And the day I was at the clinic, actually, they had bussed in a lot of other patients from Baton Rouge because the physician had recently died. And so I'm sitting around in the waiting area listening to a lot of women very concerned about getting back to Baton Rouge so they could pick up their children or meet their children, or the extra money that they were having to spend to come to New Orleans. As a patient, I was having to navigate the laws that exist in Louisiana, which are very restrictive. I had to go to the clinic twice because of the 24-hour waiting period. I had an ultrasound, although I don't remember it. I've sort of blocked that out. I do remember speaking with the physician, which is also required, a face-to-face counseling appointment, and that she was very open and warm and willing to answer my questions. But also, too, was very significant is that above the desk at the clinic, there was a huge sign that said, "No funding accepted." And having been involved with the A Fund in Louisville, I thought, oh, wow, what a shame. I wonder what that's about. And I just assumed it was abortion funding in the way that I knew. But I remember thinking, someone really ought to do something about that. And of course, I went back for the second appointment. I had a medical abortion as opposed to a surgical abortion the first time, which was completely different. I was happy to have that choice. And it went really smoothly for me. It was, like a heavy period. I got a heating pad. My boyfriend was at the house with me and was supportive. I think he felt very conflicted about my decision, but he left the decision up to me. I don't really remember that we had lengthy conversations about it. I think he was a religious person, African American, and he had definite ideas about it, but he didn't impose them on me. And so, but he was with me the night of the abortion, and as I said, it went smoothly. I didn't have any problems, and we didn't really talk about it afterwards. I take that back. We did argue about it. Not about the decision, but just, I don't remember what we were exactly arguing about. It probably may not even been related. It was just the stress. It was the stress that I was feeling and trying to include him in a way that I hoped he felt supported or included, but trying to get what I had to do for myself. And so I think that was what we were sort of arguing about a little bit. It was probably more about stress, but we didn't really talk about it much. And I felt okay with the decision this time around. I didn't feel that guilt or that shame. I just went about my life, and I think it was also a result of what I had experienced as a rape victim, is that I wanted control of my own life. And that's what I want for women. So I did return to the clinic and sort of ask about this funding issue, because I wasn't working. I was sort of figuring out what I wanted to do. I really didn't expect to start a fund. I just asked what it was about. And I remember in preparation for my own abortion, I had bought this big thing of pads that I didn't even use. And so I took it to the clinic and I said, here, perhaps you can use these. And the administrator is very astute. And she told me later that she remembered me, because I was asking questions even of the staff while I was a patient. And then I returned and was asking more questions. And so I talked with her. I said, would you be interested in starting a fund? I knew where to go to get the help to start it. And I reached back to the A Fund in Louisville and just asked, what would I need to do? Can you help me get to the summit, the NAV summit, which I had attended in the past. And they're like, yeah, just call them. They're really interested in starting new funds, so maybe they would be able to help you. And so that's what I did. I went to the summit and I just talked with a few people, and they were really, really excited. In fact, they had been trying to start a fund here. They'd been looking for different people perhaps that would be interested in doing it. And then they actually put me in touch with the woman that I co-founded it with. And so we met over a cup of coffee, and she had also been involved with the fund in DC. And it was just immediate that we would be able to work together. And we spent the summer putting together our 501c3 status and the information, and was very purposeful in raising money so that when we did start to advertise the fund, that there would be money there. And I oversaw the intake committee and the hotline for more than a year. And I fielded a lot of phone calls from women. And, it's, we talk about, the vulnerability women feel and the shame that perhaps women feel and the few resources that women have. And here's this tiny little fund that barely has any money. And we're completely volunteer, but we're distributing money and making sure women get to the clinic. And it's important. And a lot of women already have children. They already have lives. They just want to, they're making the best decisions for themselves at that moment. And they just need a little bit of money. And I guess because I had also been 21 with no money and, no family really to turn to, I came up with it. I can't remember even how I came up with that money. But, it would have been great to have known about that, to known about something like that. And women often say that, sometimes say that to me, they're shocked that there's anyone out here willing to help them financially with an abortion. And they're really so grateful even for $50. I really do understand where a lot of women come from in not being able to talk about their abortion, because I didn't talk about mine for 20 years. And even when I started the fund and realized, that I had to talk about my abortion, I didn't talk about the two of them at first. It was hard just to talk about the one that I'd recently had at 45. I mean, that seemed more acceptable, to say, well, I had one when I was 45 or 42, whatever it was. But, and even I remember the first time that I talked about my own experience in front of my peers, how nervous I was. It's one thing to have a conversation with a friend across, a cup of coffee, but it's something else to stand up as a professional among your peers to say, I've had an abortion. But we have to be genuine, or I have to be genuine. I think that's definitely what I learned about myself from the sexual assault experience, is that I was so compartmentalized and I was divorced from my own feelings, and if there's a silver lining to that experience, it was like, I have to get real with my feelings and I have to learn to be more integrated as a person and live in the world, knowing that, I haven't had a perfect linear experience. It's been very curvy and disappointing and not what I imagined for myself at 19 when I first started college. That there's been a lot of pain and a lot of disappointment. But I've tried to make the best decisions for myself based on what was in front of me. And that's what we're all trying to do. And we should support each other in that. And even if it's coming from complete strangers. So I try to be authentic. I try to I readily share my abortion experiences. I don't readily share the sexual assault. It's really too painful for me. Maybe in the future. But that is something that I talk a lot about with others and allies especially, is that these issues that we're working on are all really interconnected, that we can't divorce abortion from equal pay or Medicaid expansion or sexual assaults or domestic violence. Like, it's not, just as our lives are integrated, so are these issues, and it doesn't help us to move forward as a movement, and it doesn't help the women that we're serving if we're siloing off abortion. I feel good about that work, and it's really been a vehicle for me to grow and to really, just as it was for me to work at the clinic after my first abortion, this too is sort of another vehicle, another opportunity for me to learn more about myself, but also the women in my community and the issues and their lives, their experiences, and to work in the movement. I guess in some ways I am meant to work in some capacity. It just keeps coming back into my life over and over, and so I've just sort of said okay and see where it takes me. I think that's it.
Thank you. I have a question about when you went back to the clinic and asked them like what that sign meant, that they didn't accept funding. What did they say to you?
Well, I'm not sure if I asked them what the sign meant necessarily. I found out later that it was that they were no longer accepting NAF funding, that they had previously been able to do that, but at that point they weren't. I just asked about what the resources were, and knowing that I would need a partner, a clinic partner, if she would be interested in partnering. And it wasn't, we had some conversations, but she was really open to it. So I do feel really good that, the sign's not there, and it is partly because there's some funding available. I mean, it's not a lot of funding, but we do have the New Orleans Abortion Fund signs at the reception area and throughout the clinic.
I wondered if you could talk a little bit about navigating for yourself, I guess, the system here in New Orleans as someone who had just moved here and trying to figure out like where to get an abortion, how to do that.
Yeah, well, as I said, my male friend actually helped me to find the clinic, because, again, this was someone I had dated long distance, and really partly the reason why I had moved to New Orleans. So he was a good friend of mine, although we weren't dating at the time that I got pregnant. But we'd had conversations. In the time that I dated him, we'd had conversations. I knew that he was pro-choice, and that he'd actually helped girlfriends and others. He'd taken girlfriends to the clinic, so I knew I knew that he knew, and so I asked him, and he gave me a list of a couple clinics that he knew. Except for the inconvenience of having to go twice and sort of the humiliation of it, it wasn't that difficult for me to navigate it, because I had money, and I had a car. I could easily get there. I wasn't working full time, and so I didn't necessarily have to take a day off or tell my boss. It was really just the inconvenience sounds not the right word. The disrespect, the patronizing aspect of the laws. I mean, that it's a 24-hour waiting period, as if we haven't thought about this decision already for several weeks. That you have to have an ultrasound and it has to be explained to you in terms that are written by the state. Very biased information. That you have to sit face to face with a physician. You have to sign off on so much paperwork. I do remember that. I'm like, why do they need to know all this information? They actually ask, like, why you're having the abortion, and questions about the guy involved, his age, what parish he lives in. And I remember not wanting to answer those questions. I'm like, this is no one's business. Why are they asking so many questions? And this big, long sheet that you have to check off. And you're told that, or I know now, that it goes to the state. The state is gathering the information. So for me, it wasn't the barriers that a lot of women face, and thankfully so. I think I experienced more of those barriers when I was younger, when I was 21. And even though there wasn't, it was Cincinnati, which was a very conservative city, but it was in the early 90s. The laws were a lot different. And so, but even despite that, I had a lot of difficulty. I mean, even my own craziness, but like coming up with the money and getting there and taking time off from work and those sorts of things. So I think that these laws are probably more difficult for younger women to manage. And that was true in my own experience. I think when you're older, you probably do have more resources, you have more support systems. But even at that, it's insulting to our own decision making, our own autonomy, our own,
Why do you want to share your story?
Well, I mean, first of all, I just wanted to know what your process was out of curiosity. But also with the idea perhaps that I would gather other women's stories. And, I am doing a lot of advocacy work, and that is it's a skill, and that's a certain kind of work, which storytelling is really important to. And that's one of the strengths of the fund, is that the direct service that we provide informs the advocacy, and the advocacy informs the direct service. I mean, as a social worker, I know that the best advocates are oftentimes the people most affected, or the people working with them. And so in our advocacy work, we're often looking for women to tell their stories or to share their stories. And it's very hard for women to do that. And so how can I ask other women to share their stories if I don't share my own? And so storytelling is important. I think when I was 21, as I said, being with other women who were actually having abortions, and being with women that were working at the clinic, I was experiencing stories, and it made it more normal for me. It made it seem acceptable, at least in that little tiny bubble of the clinic, and so this silence around abortion is deafening, and it's not helpful. When 1 in 3 women have abortions, but no one wants to talk about their abortion, it's it just further stigmatizes women and isolates women. I definitely remember feeling that at 21, 22. I felt so isolated. So I guess also I'm sharing my story in an effort to be part of that work, to bring it into the open. And and I guess on a personal level, it is comforting to sort of tell it all and just lay it all out. And we don't always get that opportunity, and to be fully open with who we are. It's something I'm not good at to begin with. I don't readily share personal information with many people anyway. I'm probably a very private person. But also I think in telling the story, you learn something about yourself and you make connections that you weren't even aware of. It's like writing, that in writing something comes out that you had not thought about before, or a connection that didn't occur to you until you told the story.
Well, how do you feel now that you shared your story?
I mean, I feel fine. I mean, I offered information that I don't normally share, so that makes me feel a little vulnerable. But maybe it will help me to share those details in the future.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to listen to more of our stories, head over to our website, theabortiondiary.com. Subscribe on iTunes or listen on SoundCloud or Stitcher Radio. If you would like to share your own abortion story, visit us on our webpage, click on Share Your Abortion Story, and send me a message. To learn more about how to support The Abortion Diary, head over to our website and click on the Donate button. You can also support The Abortion Diary by telling your friends. Following The Abortion Diary on Twitter @Abortion Diary, on Instagram @The Abortion Diary, and on Facebook. You can also follow me on Instagram @The Abortion Diarist. Stay tuned for the next story.